Debajo de la pantalla podrá ver un botón que dice Interpretación o Interpretation. Haga clic en ese botón. Podrá ver dos opciones de idiomas. Seleccione el español si es que quiere escuchar este evento en español.
Hello and welcome to our webinar, Why the DC Budget is a Big Deal. I'm Ahoifa Ananuko, Policy Associate for the ACLU of the District of Columbia, and I'll be moderating tonight's event. We will get started momentarily, but first, some housekeeping items. This webinar is being recorded and everyone is in listen-only mode. Closed captions are available for this event. If the captions do not start automatically, you can access it by hovering your mouse over the CC icon at the bottom of your Zoom window and clicking Show Subtitles. We begin all ACLU DC events, even if they are virtual, with a land acknowledgement to recognize and show respect to the traditional stories of the land we occupy and to remind ourselves of the lasting impacts of colonization in the Washington, DC area. While we know it is not exhaustive, we hope this statement can ground today's discussion in racial equity and racial justice. And now we'll begin the land acknowledgement. We acknowledge the stolen and abused land we occupy in the Washington, DC area. The Piscataway Indian Nation and Piscataway Conoy Confederacy originally lived in large parts of present-day Maryland and DC. Among the first to encounter white European colonists, by 1700, 97% of the Piscataway chiefdom lost their lives to European diseases, war, and loss of land. The District of Columbia was also an active slave depot with slave auctions dotting the National Mall and groups of chained slaves passing in view of Congress and the White House every day. We honor the Indigenous and Black lives that were taken by violent colonization and state-sanctioned brutality, as well as the enduring strength of Indigenous and Black communities, and we commit ourselves to turning this knowledge into action by fighting white supremacy in all of its forms. Thank you all once again for taking the time to join us this evening. Tonight we'll be discussing DC's budget and how we can all do our part to ensure that it reflects a move towards a more just and equitable Washington, DC. Here at the ACLU DC, we often say that the budget is a moral document, meaning the decisions elected officials make about how to spend public money reflects our priorities and who we think matters. It is crucial that the public is involved in this process, and we encourage all of you to offer your input on what DC should prioritize. We hope you'll ask us questions during tonight's conversation, and you can do so by using the Q&A feature, which you'll find at the bottom of your Zoom window. The icon looks like a pair of speech bubbles. After we hear from our panelists, we'll get into your questions. To kick things off, let's meet our panelists. We'll start with Eliana. Please tell us your name, your pronouns, and how your organization's work relates to the DC budget.
Hi, everyone. My name is Eliana Golding. I use she, her pronouns. I'm a policy analyst at the DC Fiscal Policy Institute. And as you might be able to tell from the name of our organization, we deal with fiscal policy, and what is sort of the epitome of fiscal policy, it's the budget. So most of our work is really around research and analysis and advocacy around the DC budget and policy and various policy areas that we focus on, like affordable housing, education, homelessness, taxes, et cetera, et cetera. So we are gearing up for the fiscal year 22 budget cycle. So I'll leave it there.
Great, thank you. Lark?
Hi, my name is Lark. I'm a longtime DC resident, grew up in DC. best way I could say and describe myself, I feel like I'm a lone wolf, but I was mothered by Aja Taylor, and you'll learn more about her. She activated me in 2017, feels like forever. And I got into activism through her and Bread for the City and all the great things about organizing within the city. So yes.
Great. And Aja.
Oh, that was funny. So I'm Aja, aka Mother Wolf, apparently. I use she and her pronouns, and I'm the Advocacy and Organizing Director at Bread for the City. Bread for the City is actually a direct services organization we provide medical services, legal services, civil legal services, social services, and food. So food and clothing. My role is actually fairly new. It came about in about 2015 when our organization began asking ourselves the question, what it meant to be a more racially equitable organization, and really what that meant for a direct services organization who is able to exist because of the fact that people are poor, right? Like that's why people give nonprofits money, because people don't have resources of their own. And part of the question became, if we are an organization that says that we believe in racial equity, then what is our role in making sure that the city is a more just, equitable place to live? And so my role is managing a really dynamic team of organizers, of folks who also receive services at Bread, of folks who are just like concerned folks, poor and working class people who know that we deserve better from the city and that we deserve better from this government. And frankly, that the government has the money to do it. And so our relationship to the budget basically is like, show us the money. We know you have it, and we know that the people deserve it.
Great. And our final panelist, Brian.
Hey everyone, my name is Brian McClure. My pronouns are he, him, and I represent the government. So shout out to my fellow Hamptonian on the panel for acknowledging that. But I am the director of the newly established Council Office of Racial Equity. And our goal is to operationalize, normalize, and organize and invest in racial equity. We believe the government played a central role in creating many of the racial inequities that we see exist nationwide, but specifically in the district. And so our role is to help the government also play a central role in reversing some of these inequities that we see today. And so we'll talk a lot more in depth about CORE's role in this year's budget process. One of the things that I'm excited to talk about is an oversight toolkit that our office has created that we're already seeing members using as they approach how to frame budget oversight in a racial equity lens. So thanks again for having me. Excited to be here today.
Great, we will look forward to that toolkit. So let's start with the basics. DC's budget for FY21 was just short of $17 billion. Eliana, could you tell us how we arrived at this figure by walking us through the budget process?
Sure. So yes, you are correct in that the total budget, and we'll say, we'll complexify sort of like what is the budget here, is roughly $17 billion. And that is both a number that the district has taken in revenue and what we're spending, our expenditures. But so the money that we largely focus on at DCFPI and is really the local fund, which is closer to $9 billion. And the reason that I say that is because this really is the focus of our advocacy, what we have the most influence over in terms of in our work with the council. So the difference there is that $17 billion includes money that comes from the federal government. It includes money like enterprise funds, like the DC Water, for example, whereas the local fund is more of what we think about when we're thinking about the operations, of the day-to-day programs that we think about and advocate for. So that's sort of part one. And I think we have a slide to talk about the process. So I'll give you sort of like two parts. First, we'll talk about the process, the budget process for how do we how do we run the city? Where, like, how does the documents that we, you know, how do we put money towards things? How do we decide on what that is? And I really like the way you framed it as like the budget is a moral document. And so I'll get into that a little bit. So I'll talk about process, and then I'll talk about sort of the details of the money. So in front of you, you have this sort of cycle, really is a cycle. So each budget cycle starts for the public kind of around now. Maybe some of you went to the budget engagement forums with the mayor or the mayors, the sort of the deputy mayors. Right now, there are performance oversight hearings happening. And so those are sort of opportunities for the public and for representatives from DC agencies to reflect and to show, like, here's how we've performed over the last year. And then after that, the mayor will submit her budget to the council and on March 31st. And that's the moment where here at DCPI, we freak out, we download the budget books, we're like deep in the charts, trying to figure out how much money did she allocate for each of the programs that we advocate for. And then following that, the council then has budget oversight hearings in which the public and government witnesses testify about, here's how much money went to this, we need more for this or less for this. And some of you may have testified at those before. We'll talk probably more about how to get involved in that. And then after that, there's a markup period where the DC Council takes the budget that the mayor has given them and then marks it up and says, no, we want to change this, we want to move money over here. And then they have 2 votes on it. Yeah, that's sort of like, that's the basics. And then it gets enacted. And then over the course of the year, there might be shifts within the budget. And so you'll see often, so on March 31st, we're going to expect to see not just the budget for fiscal year 2022, which I find to be the hardest word to say, 2022, but also a supplemental budget for modifications for the fiscal year that we are currently in, which is fiscal year 2021. So that's sort of an overview on the process. We can talk more about the details on that during the question and answer if you want those. Some other important events that happen in this time, I see it's on here, is the CAFR, which is the Comprehensive Annual Financial Report, which gives us a sense of how much money comes in to the district. So that's really important for us to know because that's how we make our budget. Great, so I think we're done with the slide for now. And I can just give you a very quick breakdown of the money itself. So like I said before, roughly $9 billion, it's a lot of money. And so I mentioned before, the budget breaks down when we think about it into revenue. So that's how much money we're taking in, and our expenditures, which is how much we're spending on things. And like a regular person, the district actually has to balance its budget completely. So the expenditures have to match revenue. You can't spend more than you have. And unlike the federal government, which can say, actually, we need $1 trillion in stimulus, we're gonna make that happen. We can't do that. So talking about revenue now, the vast majority of our revenue in local funds comes from taxes. You might be seeing us talk a bit about taxes and revenue later during the year, but majority it comes from our property taxes, income taxes, and sales taxes. It's in that order too, the most from property taxes, then income, then sales, and then some others. And in terms of our expenditures, which is how much DC spends on different aspects of the budget, like public education, human support services, public safety and justice, operations and infrastructure. These are the categories, how the government breaks it down. We spend just over half of our local budget on human services and public education. So put those together, it's about 53%. The next runner up is public safety and justice at 15% of our budget. So I won't get you bogged down in numbers. I'll stop there, but we can talk more about specifics.
Yeah, as folks can see, this is all a very complicated and, nitty-gritty process, but we thank folks like DCFPI, the Mayor's Budget Office, Fair Budget Coalition, and the DC Council's office, because these are all places folks can also go to find more information about the budget. And feel free to reach out to those agencies if you do have more questions regarding the process, the amounts. We'll get more into some of those later. So turning now to Brian. We know DC's budget is unique among that of other states because it is essentially a combination of a city, county, and a state budget. How would statehood affect the DC budget? Or put it slightly differently, how does the lack of statehood affect DC's control of its budget?
Yeah, so thank you for that question. And Eliana, great job explaining that. Like, that's a lot of information to consolidate into what, less than 5 minutes? So shout out to you for that. But first and foremost, statehood is a matter of racial equity. And that's the reason why in 1965, Dr. King marched alongside activists and residents such as Reverend Walter Fauntleroy to advocate for self-determination. And so, you know, the super short and most direct answer is that statehood would mean that Congress would have their hands out of the affairs of the district. And so what does that mean? And why does Congress have their hands in the district's budget? So when we look at laws that are passed through council, once they go on and they're signed by the mayor, they then are sent on to Congress for a passive review. After a certain amount of time goes by, I believe it's about 30 days, those laws go into effect without certain affirmative actions being taken by Congress. With the budget and the supporting documents, those are actually sent over to Congress and are approved through congressional appropriations process, which means that Congress has to vote on the district's budget. So after we go through the whole song and dance that Eliana was just talking about, it still is not law until Congress votes on it. That's a big problem. And one of the reasons it's a problem is because Congress likes to use this trick or mechanism called riders that they slide into the federal appropriations. Now, these riders are extremely problematic. So after we pass laws, we being the district pass laws, after we then invest in the budget, Congress can still slide in riders that say, well, no, you can't regulate and you can't regulate cannabis, for example, or you can't control your own gun legislation, or you know, other policies such as the right to die, which council passed a few years ago when Congress stepped in. And so even when we get down to abortions, women's rights, we see how Republicans, you know, always try to step in, and also Democrats, to raise questions and try to tell the district what they can and can't do. And so there are also other implications. If we were to receive statehood, it would allow the district to begin considerations of how to align the fiscal year with other state and local governments as well. And so right now, our budget will go into effect October 1. And so, which is most states and local jurisdictions, their budgets go into effect sometime in July. And this has other implications as well. I'll also note, and I'll conclude here, Congresswoman Norton has actually just called a hearing on statehood. So Congress, the House committee is going to be holding a hearing, I believe, on March 11th. And so make sure that you're following along to learn more and hear about the conversations that are being had. And I also want to shout out DCFPI, who issued a blog. Donnie Crawford wrote a blog called First in Line that talks about some of the implications as well. And so there are a lot of people even on this panel who are doing some really important work. So thanks for that question.
Thank you for that. That's very important information. And folks, if you're interested in getting involved in statehood initiatives, you can reach out to Brian's office, you can reach out to us for more info. And as always, Ms. Norton is your rep, so you can always reach out to her office as well. I mentioned earlier that the budget is a moral document. For each of our panelists, what does that mean to you? And why is it important for DC residents to weigh in on the process? We can begin with Lark.
Okay, so I always, this means a lot to me in the sense of I'm also on the, I'm familiar with the Poor People's Campaign as well, and they always bring up morals. Sad to say, as much as we want to say it's a moral document, I feel like it's the weakest argument. When we look at the federal level, we say morals all the time, and the conservatives say, oh, we have the family values, the liberals, they have the I love you, everybody, anybody. So I'm like, morals just is not a good argument, especially in a capitalist society, just to be fair and honest with, yes, we have like 500,000 people dying in COVID-19. Yes, to be fair and honest, like the budget and our council members do not do what they're supposed to be doing. But to be fair and honest, like our elected officials only care about the dollars, and that's where we're at. So as much as we want to say you are morally wrong, it's not a fair enough argument towards them, and that's their stance. So that's my 2 cents.
Aja?
Yeah, building on Lark's point, if a budget is a moral document, then I think it really calls into question the morals of elected officials. When we have a city that is spending so much money, more money to incarcerate Black and brown people than to house them affordably, it really does beg the question, what are the morals, what are the values of this government? When Mayor Bowser says that every resident deserves a fair shot, which residents is she talking about, right? Because it can't be the residents who are, at the top of the pandemic, our Latinx residents some were afraid to go to the hospitals, right? Because ICE was still like meeting people at emergency rooms. There were folks who are in public housing who are living in deplorable conditions, right? In conditions that people wouldn't want to live in themselves. And yet, only recently has this council been funding public housing in a way that shows that it's even a little bit important, let alone a priority. I had a conversation with someone today, the number of people who call me every day talking about how, asking where the housing is. And, my job exists. I'm clear that my job exists because the answer right now is it doesn't. That the person who called me today, who is a person who a lot of people in the government would call on, would lift up as a person who was like a person who came home from jail and really was like doing big things, found herself severely physically disabled, is in an unsafe housing situation, and like the resources for her are incredibly slim. And what that means in a city that has a $9 billion budget, in a city that prioritizes getting new chargers for the cops, that prioritizes getting new militarized equipment, getting tear gas for the cops, who prioritizes, I sat in a hearing that council member, well, it was not Nadeau's hearing, it was a committee of the whole hearing, but where in the exact same hearing, okay, so like within the same couple hours, we heard that there wasn't enough money to fund legislation that actually be fair to people who are experiencing homelessness. So legislation that can make sure they got bathrooms, or legislation that can make sure that they had, didn't have to prove that they were homeless, right? Because as if, homeless folks are trying to trick the system. So they said they didn't have enough money for that. And in the exact same hearing, this council passed an $82 million subsidy to a developer for a parking lot. And so when you look at a group of folks who have the power over $9 billion, who say a parking lot is more important than children who are literally, in harm's way, what does that say about the morals of such a government, right?
Thank you. Yeah. Brian, you want to add to any of that?
Yeah, I would say for CORE, the Council Office of Racial Equity, it represents choices. And a lot of times we see choices are made that ultimately end up maintaining the status quo. And so part of our job is to heightened consciousness to how these choices that we make of where to invest, choices of cuts that are made. Even when we talk about, evaluating programs that exist, people may say that, well, these programs are failed programs because we're not moving the needle on them. Well, maybe that's because some policies are just bad policies. And maybe because we haven't focused on comprehensive approaches that are aimed at structural inequities. And so one of the things that I'm very interested in is equipping members, providing these tools for the executive as well, and for folks in the community, so that we can start to get at what these root causes are and ensure that every step that we're taking is being directed and channeled at programs that will get at the root causes of what these issues are. And so I'll make sure I'll try to figure out how to get this toolkit out to you all, but I'm really excited. We're already starting to see behaviors this budget cycle beginning to change, because members are taking questions from the toolkit to send to agency directors to ask them, how are they collecting data along racial lines? What are the barriers to collecting data? When we talk about issues around poverty, for example, why is it that poverty is increasing, specifically for Black residents in the district? Why is it that poverty is even 28% in the district? And how are we using the budget to eliminate these gaps that exist? So there's a lot more I can say, but I want to make sure I'm being respectful to other panelists. And
Thank you. Eliana?
Yeah, I think the other panelists said it really beautifully. I think one thing that I'll add is I was thinking about the mayor's budget forums and how she, the way it works, it's like you have $100, dole it out, where you choose. And I always think that it's such a false choice, because it's like it really doesn't accurately reflect the process. And I think, as everyone really put it thus so far, there's like entrenched programs, there's entrenched inequality, there's entrenched racism, like these things are built into our very institutions and then very society. And so we can't just say like, oh, here's money, here's programs, we'll like divvy it up and it'll, this reflects our priorities, we're done. I think that there's, we have to be thinking about how these things are interconnected. And I think another thing that's sort of like false about it is that it's like, why is it only 100 million? Why is it only $100 actually? Like, why are our tax rates the way they are? Why aren't we taxing the wealthy more if we have such severe need in our city? And so I would say the budget is a moral document because it reflects our choice, and also our tax policy also reflects our values. And so that's something that we're going to be focusing on over the next year.
Thank you. Thank you all for those very, very thoughtful answers. Aja and Lark, you mentioned, several key issues with, the budget and how we see it as a moral document, whether or not it can be considered a moral document. And along those lines, what do you see as barriers to residents engaging in the budget process in a meaningful way? And what responsibility does the council have in making it easier for constituents to testify in hearings, or making it more accessible for constituents to testify? Whichever one of you wants to take it first.
All right, I'll take Aja's cue. I mean, I'm always pushing the boundaries. There are obvious ways of traditionally doing it. I'll just, I guess, talk about my pathway, right? So because I got interested in the advocacy department with Aja and at Bread for the City, I learned the traditional way, and through these, I don't remember everybody, Fair Budget Coalition, they taught me how to sign up to hearings. They have different committees. So if I was interested in housing or food justice, and that was a great funnel to also find out the different organizations and nonprofits within the city. And so if you're interested, for example, in food, then DC Greens is a great organization to help you understand the food inequalities in the city. If you're interested in housing, again, like Bread for the City, some, and a few other nonprofits, Miriam's Kitchen is super active in the housing issues in the city. So I it would encourage, it makes more sense to kind of latch on to a nonprofit like One DC or Empower DC and learn how to testify through them, because numbers is power. So, and that's how I learned how to get involved.
So you mentioned at the beginning of your response, you learned the traditional way. What do you mean by the traditional way of
Yes, because traditionally, if you want engagement, that is how you should go about doing it. And it might be foreshadowing the next question, but obviously it just feels as though traditionally doing these things, does it really make an impact? Is it engaging enough? And our council has shown like it really doesn't consider our voices as much as it should. So, you know, I'm here and I'm in other places because I've realized I've done countless meetings with council members, and I feel like they're there for show. They're there for banter. They're there to act like they care, honestly, and I don't feel like they do. I'm frustrated, as I think a lot of people are. So my pushing the boundaries at this point is like this platform, educating yourself. I've talked to so many other folks that are like questioning and what's going on and how to be involved and who should I even vote for? That was a question I heard last year. Like, and where do I go to find out who to vote for, and you know, give me evidence and this and the third. And I know I was very frustrated with the endorsement stuff and all these campaign signs, and there's really no platform to really truly educate folks. Like, I look at these bills, I have no idea what these bills are about. Like, I didn't go to college for policy making. So yes, I have a dream that, and I have these two teenagers here, if you don't see these, my background. This is controversial, but I didn't want my 16, 17-year-old to vote because I felt like they were just trying to widen their voter base and still keep DC residents ignorant. And to be honest and fair, that's what DC Council doesn't want. They don't want educated DC voters. So I want, they have these websites for these teenagers. I'm like, have a website platform that teaches people policy in layman's terms. All those bills that they push out, educate folks what those are about. Voting history of council members, any elected official, school board, ANC, whoever is you have to vote for, I want their voting history. And then ANCs, because I didn't even know about ANCs until I started going to Bread for the City. And I keep on asking other people that went to DC public schools, did you learn about ANCs? No one has told me they have, at least around the 90s. So, but yes, educating yourself and asking those questions, I really think that will be the threat that DC Council really needs, like, to hear us out. So that's how I push the limits.
I also
okay. Oh, sorry. Kind of related to this, and Lark, you can, excuse me, Aja, you can also, if you wanted to add to that previous question, but my next question also is, if folks who are watching this right now and they want to get involved in the budget process, perhaps they want to have a say, but they don't know how, or folks may know how, but are nervous about how to engage with the process, what advice would you give them, and what resources can they access to make this easier? And then also, if you want to add to what the responsibility of the council is in making it more accessible for people to engage with the process.
Yeah, so to answer the question you asked, there are really tremendous organizations like the Fair Budget Coalition that has a constituent engagement program that's specifically for getting more folks who are not nonprofit professionals, who are not policy wonks, to get not just more involved and more educated about the budget, but also active in doing basically like citizens oversight, right? So if what we're saying is that council isn't doing tight enough oversight over MPD, right? Or they're not doing tight enough oversight over healthcare, they're not doing tight enough oversight over public education, like the whole question of schools reopening. Like, there are ways for folks who are parents, folks who are, just like folks off the street, to get engaged and get involved. And Fair Budget Coalition is a really great opportunity for that. Organizations like ours, like DC Fiscal Policy Institute, like their budget, also give trainings on the budget. So like the spiel that Eliana gave at the beginning is part of a really dope training that DC Fiscal Policy Institute does for folks who just want to get a little more in the weeds about what's in the budget. And it's really boring. So I think that one of the barriers to getting involved in the budget is that it is boring. It's the same thing like for barriers. So my life is affordable housing policy, and it is incredibly boring. And that's intentional, right? So there is a piece of me that feels really clear that the reason why I'm able to translate things into layman's terms because I actually have a vested interest in people understanding, and poor and working class people understanding what's going on. And the systems that create these policies, the systems and the people in power who create these things do not have a vested interest in people actually being able to fully civically engage. Otherwise, there would be hearings in people's neighborhoods. Otherwise, there would already be ways for people, the number of seniors who I hear from who don't have the ability to testify because they don't have a way, because they're disabled and don't have a way to get to counsel. The number of poor and working class people who cannot take off work to come testify at a 10 a.m. hearing. I was there when there were women from DC General who wanted to testify about why they needed bathrooms, why private bathrooms were an issue of mental health. And we were there when Phil Mendelson, I love naming names because like whatever, facts are facts. And Phil Mendelson told these women that they couldn't be first to testify, even though he knew they needed to leave and pick up their children, right? And so then we proceeded to watch scores of white women who had never been homeless, who had never experienced homelessness, right? Perhaps didn't even know anyone personally in their lives who had experienced homelessness, talk about why poor Black women at DC General didn't need a private bathroom. And so those are the stakes, right? Like Black women lose, Black queer folks lose, Black trans folks lose when the status quo is maintained, but the people in power have a vested interest in that continuing to happen. And so every year when we have budget engagement forums, I always laugh when I see that graphic because budget engagement forums are not the beginning of the cycle, right? Like by the budget engagement forums, spoiler alert, the mayor has already had tons of meetings with people and already has actually a pretty solidified budget, right? And I have comrades in the Cancel the Rent Coalition who like reached out for meetings for the mayor and get like a really nice letter back that's like, blah, 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 I can't meet with you, right? And so like, what does that mean? It goes back to the question of the budget being a moral document. It is surely a part of this question of why is it so difficult for the average person to be able to really fully engage in this process? And yeah, is a part of like why it's important to get involved and to not only for folks to find opportunities to be educated about the budget, but for those of us who are in organizations where we make a living, make a salary because poor and working class people exist. It's also up to us to be sure that we are providing opportunities to translate that and providing opportunities for people to fully engage.
Yeah, those are all very, I say we should all petition for Aja to host webinars on processes in DC. And we can add to the list of demands of things we need to see change. And speaking of demands, this past summer, thousands of people, far more than ever, submitted or gave live testimony for the police budget oversight hearing. And most people overwhelmingly called for divestment from policing and investment into community services. Eliana, how does the district's budget as it currently stands measure up to those demands?
A great question that I am really excited to hear lots of people answer in the hearings that are coming up, and also in all the other ways that people do advocacy around this. I'll give just one version of an answer that it really starts with, it depends how you measure things. So if you look at the numbers, the police budget did not decrease between last year and this year. When I was putting together the toolkit, the budget toolkit that we put together on the public safety and justice budget last summer, I was thinking about how to frame like a little bit of the success that activists had, because the budget that was passed was less, the police budget that was passed was less than what was proposed. So that's a win. That indicates that on some level, folks got through to council. That is not to say any cookies are being handed out here, and that some of the messaging that was coming from council was like, look, the budget is like X amount less this year than it was last year. But when you actually look at the local funds going to MPD, it went up. And so I think it's really important. I loved the way Aja just described that, is like, in terms of like engagement, and when Lark was saying about education, it's really important for accountability for us to be digging into those details, and to just like hold some accountability. I would say that there were increases to some of the Office of Neighborhood Safety and Engagement. There were increases to some of those programs. Many would say, I would say not nearly enough. And I also would say there is no evidence. In fact, no money was moved away from NPD and put into like programs like affordable housing in any way. So there's a long way to go there. And I think we have, there's precedent to stand on. And yeah, I'll just leave it there. Happy to answer more.
So we got a ways to go. Like you touched on this a little bit earlier, and could you just tell us, as a DC native who has experienced homelessness, and you mentioned being raised by a mother who has mental illness, and you're also raising a teenage boy who has a mental illness, and from your experience and from seeing the budget throughout the years, how well do you think the DC Council has addressed homelessness and mental illness in the budget?
It's shameful, to be honest. Yeah. My face is in the way, so I'm gonna just pull. That's my mother, my adoptive mother. She died in November. She had paranoid schizophrenia. And yeah, I want to make it very clear that why is housing and mental illness always devalued in the budget? A lot of stigma, a lot of shame, it's very similar and intertwined, right? Because a lot of homeless people are also mentally ill, and to account for the recent death of Angela Hill. And to be very clear, people reached out to her. Her family knew where she was. And I'll just put it out there. We have Britney Spears out there, and everyone wants to free her. And I'll be honest, like, I understand conservatorship and guardianship because of my mother. So I'm like, why we want a white woman, a famous rich white woman, to have her freedom, to have control over her affairs, and we're letting a Black woman die on the streets, right? Someone should have had conservatorship or guardianship over her if they wanted her to live. Just to be honest. And I'm sorry, I'm getting a little emotional. But we need to reflect on our society. We're a classist, racist society. And we really want to eliminate our innate prejudice of how we treat poor people. I've been on food stamps for the entire time I've raised my soon-to-be adult's child in a week from now. And I remember, like, I got a job and they reduced my food stamps because I got a job and my kids are getting bigger. So you're punishing me for trying to be better, right? So we have a society that constantly wants to punish you. We have a society right now where all the working moms are eliminated from the workforce. I'm not working right now. I know someone else that just got laid off because working moms cannot be taking care of their kids and holding a job at the same time, especially if you're a single mom. So we constantly as a society like punishing people. We're letting them go homeless, and we're really not batting an eye. We are uncomfortable. We're ashamed about the mentally ill and the homeless, right? And we would rather see them go homeless. We don't want to put in the dollars and cents to save people to stay in their homes, and then wonder why people aren't showing up to school. We're wondering why the achievement gap is there. We're wondering why crime is up. I'm like, it's because you've been shitty to the poor Black, brown people in the city for years before COVID, and COVID has only just highlighted it. But mental illness, let's just circle back on that, right? It is a stigma, and we are ashamed about that. And let me find out what other people do in other countries, right? There's a cycle too that I just don't get. where you also get a job and then you don't have the money for your medication. Like, and then you have that standard where you have to be medicated first before getting housed. I want stability. Everybody wants stability. Housing needs to come first. You should not have these little like check marks to get housing. It just should be a human right. And to be fair, just like, you know, if we really want to save money, you save lives first, then you save money, healthcare, all that stuff. You save lives just by housing people first. And I think everything will fall in play after that.
Yeah, that's very powerful. Thank you so much for sharing that. And, you know, with what Lar just said in mind, she mentioned that, you know, oftentimes it's Black and brown poor people that are being punished, you know, for their poverty, oftentimes for things that are out of their hands. And, you know, back in the summer, the DC Council, summer or maybe it was November, excuse me, I'm losing track of time as we all have during COVID, passed the REACH Act. So Brian, can you tell us what the REACH Act is and how will the Office of Racial Equity review the budget through a racial equity lens to address some of those things Lark just mentioned?
Yeah, absolutely. And first, I think it's important to kind of stop and pause and thank Lark for being vulnerable and sharing her
Yes, absolutely.
experiences. And I just want to underscore CORE, the Council Office of Racial Equity, we are here so that we can help lift those voices up. And she started to mention other countries that have figured this out. We don't even have to go out to other countries. We can look at other states that have actually figured out innovative approaches to engage the community in this, not only in decision-making processes, but actually giving them stake in implementation. And so if we really wanted to do some innovative things, you know, we don't have to go and look in all these different places. We can just get down and make the commitment to do so. And so it wasn't in the summer, it was actually in the fall. Like everything is like running together. And so introduced originally by Councilmember Ken McDuffie and unanimously supported, the Racial Equity Achieves Results legislation set out to do several things. One, to create Office of Racial Equity within the council, and also an executive Office of Racial Equity under the mayor. Within the council, the specific focus is to ensure that every bill or the majority of permanent bills undergo racial equity impact assessments. We're also here to ensure that members and staff have access to racial equity trainings and that we work with the community to bring equitable community engagement. And so I'm really happy that we're having this conversation because CORE has already begun the process of working with community partners in order to look at innovative ways and bring and hold members accountable to actually give community voices a seat at the table. And so we take two primary steps here at CORE. One is that we develop racial equity toolkits on the front end. So before a member even introduces a bill, we are encouraging them to stop and ask a set of questions. And one of the questions, just for the sake of time, asks who from the community should be involved in designing, governing, or executing the solution or proposal. And then we ask them to note if they are already involved in the drafting process, or what your first step will be to involve them, or why are you not involving them? And to stop and ask these questions is something that has not happened before. And so I've worked in several offices, and a lot of times we are just, we have small offices. We're trying to work with the community. We're trying to like move legislation. And so CORE fills a very important gap in helping to help members to slow the process down and work to make sure that we are incorporating and operationalizing racial equity. Then on the back end, we are applying a formal racial equity impact assessment so that members, staff, and the public understand how this legislation is burdening communities of color, if it's benefiting those communities, And then it's also going a step further. So like one of the things that Lark, I'm glad she talked about, was the issues of accessibility. And so even if we pass legislation, right, is it something that's only going to be mobile or digital? And who does that burden? And so even when we look at legislation, what are the first, second, third order of effects and unintended consequences? And so we are even hoping, and I'll end with this, to take innovative approaches. We've seen surrounding jurisdictions create equity action circles where they actually bring in folks from the community to help them conduct the racial equity impact assessments. And so I'm throwing this out there to my panelists that I would love to work with you all to where we can figure out how to work together to figure out what a process like that could look like.
Thank you so much for sharing that. Please, in the chat, join me in showing some love and thanking our panelists, Aja, Brian, Eliana, and Lark. Thank you so much for sharing your thoughts with us. Next, we're going to move into our questions from the audience. And we're going to begin with some questions that were submitted in advance. But folks, if you have questions, please do use the Q&A feature to ask questions, and we will try to get to as many as we can with the remainder of our time. So our first audience submitted question for all of our panelists, if you want to answer: how has the COVID-19 pandemic both revealed and exacerbated economic and racial disparities in the district, and what is the government's responsibility to address these disparities through the budget? Some of you guys already touched on this. If anybody wants to add any other points on that?
I want to add
specifically to COVID. Yeah, sorry.
Yeah, I want to add primarily that for me, it uncovered actually or proved what we already knew to be true, which is that the government actually can take decisive, immediate action to alleviate the suffering of poor and working class people. And when they don't, it is a choice not to. So when we saw government step in and have a moratorium on evictions, when Bread and Empower DC and other folks have had a campaign around public housing residents not being evicted, not having to pay rent when they live in deplorable conditions, and we're told that's impossible, that can't happen. A pandemic comes and suddenly, magically, it's able to happen. We're told that there can't be funds given to people who aren't citizens, with a lot of pressure, right? A lot of advocacy. Shout out to DC Jobs with Justice. Shout out to the Latina vendors who go hard. Like we see things like that come and happen. They say, oh, there can't be any kind of basic income, but are able to find money, right, to supplement unemployment insurance, which are all great things. And for me as an organizer, it's like, yes, and these are things you already should have been doing. The fact that there's a campaign right now, that there even needs to be a campaign to say that the council should cancel rent is ludicrous. It is ludicrous when we know that people do not have the money to pay their rent, right? Like we just know that. And so for me, not only, I think there's like a lot of ways that COVID obviously uncovered a lot of inequities and injustice, but for me, what was the most stark was just how much ability the government has to get itself together when they also are at risk.
That's very well put. Do any of our other panelists want to add to that?
Yeah, if I can add, not just on what the government has proven that they're able to do, but what they have not yet done. I mentioned before the CAFR, the Comprehensive Annual Financial Report that came out recently, and what it showed is that basically there are two economies happening right now. There's one in which low-wage workers, people who are working in the gig economy, folks without a consistent salary, they have been hit so hard by this pandemic. I mean, it's somewhat obvious maybe, but we've been hearing some really powerful stories about this, and there's been incredible organizing around getting aid to these folks. On the other hand, those with salaries who work, like nonprofit jobs, myself included, are doing just fine. I have not taken a financial hit from the pandemic, and those with the ability to invest in the stock market also doing just fine, even seeing, you know, their wealth increase in this time. So the fact that we have a structure, an economy structured so that people are earning low wages, and in DC that largely means Black and brown folks, suffering even more financially because of this pandemic, whereas those who, you know, were already financially stable are doing better. That is an enormous red flag about just how broken this system is, or, you know, the fact that it was designed this way. And so I would say what can be done about that is raise taxes on the wealthy.
All right. And then our final question, unfortunately, we don't have a lot more time. You guys have all offered some wonderful insights, and I wish I could talk to y'all forever. But, you know, one of the things COVID has taught us was, you know, to rely on our neighbors. And at the forefront of this in DC and also around the country has been mutual aid groups, who have been a huge part of the community response to COVID. I know, Lark, you're part of one of the local mutual aid groups. So how have, if they have, city officials learned from the successes of non-government groups like mutual aid? And what might be some ways the district can modify the budget to fill the gaps that mutual aid groups have been filling? And is it even appropriate? Is it even an appropriate role for the district government to be taking on? If not, why?
Yeah, so I'm sorry, it's gonna be a roundabout answer as per usual. I've been in this space for a little while, and I just realized it's a very unhealthy relationship between nonprofits, and I know I'll retouch on mutual aid, but nonprofits and government, right? And that's why I do like Fair Budget Coalition, because, and I'll do my spiel about Fair Budget Coalition. That organization basically is organizing other nonprofits, and it's perfect the way it's put together, because all these nonprofits are fighting for the same dollars usually, right? And that's what's sad. Like, that's the unhealthy relationship. Nonprofits need government, but government keeps on doing what it's not supposed to do. And if it just did what it's supposed to do, we wouldn't need nonprofits. So it's just this unhealthy, right? And then we have these huge like Jeff Bezos types that don't pay their taxes, but guess what? They get tax breaks, right, for putting in money to charity. So it's just this, and America just loves charity. Like, if we put all our effort not into charity, but all our effort in advocating just do right by your people, then again, we save so much money, time, and effort, because, and, you know, I keep on reading other countries, like, they're happy paying taxes because they don't see homeless on the street. They're happy to pay taxes because they have free healthcare and education, all this other stuff. So why do we love charity? It's just to feel good at that very moment within our own bubble of happiness and wealth. And we're not, you know, we have too much scapegoats and loopholes in this society, and we've bat an eye and we're saying we're okay with that. But to circle back, because I know I like preaching and going all over the place, mutual aid has been good in a sense of it does not judge who they take care of. And that is the true reason and issue with government. They judge and have so much prejudice. And like I said before about my own food stamps, why you feel like hurting poor people for being poor. Stop judging them for saying you need a handout. This is an issue of I do a shame on how dare you have a family that was able to help you to begin with. How dare you had a family that never let you feel hungry or insecure or belittled you. All right. I love my mother, but she wasn't the greatest. Okay. So abuse, all that other stuff. We talk about trauma. Trauma does not need to be in the school system in the sense of like, oh, let's help the traumatic kids in the school system. Trauma, informed care, whatever, need to be in the homes, right? I could have been a better mother if I learned better anger management. Now I have teenagers like punching holes in my door. I'm just saying we need to refix our brains and how we approach, you know, quote unquote, poor people. Stop belittling them. Stop acting like, oh, if we put you in a mixed income development, things will get better. No, you're dismantling a community. That's what you're doing. You're displacing people. Okay. You're making them feel worthless and they don't belong here. That's the issue. So mutual aid is great because it's no judgment. And that's what I wish the government understood. no judgment of what people really need and give
Thank
them what
you.
they really need.
Well, folks, you heard it from Lark and the rest of our panelists. Please, please, please help me in the comments or chat section to thank our panelists for sharing their insights today. You know, we thank you all once again for joining us tonight and for spending your time with us this evening. Please be sure to follow our panelists as well as the ACLU DC on Twitter. We hope you'll save the day for our next storytelling training webinar, where you can get trained by our very own ACLU DC staff on how to use effective storytelling in your advocacy. You know, some of the things we heard today are, drawn from like Lark, telling your personal story. That's one very persuasive way to tell the council what needs to change. So our next storytelling advocacy training will be on Saturday, March 20th from noon to 1:30, and registration will be available soon on the ACLU DC website. And you can also follow us on our social media for updates. Thank you all once again so much for joining us tonight, and good night. Thank you.